But yeah, if you could just hold fire a couple of minutes, just wait for the last couple to trickle in. And before we get started, you should be able to use the chat function. So please feel free to use that if, as any of our guests are speaking, you have any questions that come to mind. And there'll be time for Q&A at the end. We've got most people in by the looks of things.
Did it pop up and say that we're live on Facebook? Did it come up saying that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, awesome.
Just, yes, we're live on Facebook, just so you know. Jordan Gill, we're hoping to be done before 8. I assume that was a question to me and not to the panelists.
Okay, awesome. Shall we start then? Are you all right to let people in while I'm introducing it?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Awesome. Hi everyone, welcome to this event. I'm Amy, the Policy Officer for the International Young Fabian Network, and this is Tom. Do you want to introduce yourself, Tom?
Oh, sure, I can introduce myself. I'm Tom. I am part of the Young Fabian International Network. I'm also the Policy Officer for the Education Network. Obviously have an interest in international affairs and, of course, space.
I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to Ben for helping us to organise this. You're a star, and I'll put you on. I'll make you a co-host so you can be on like Zoom bombing duty. Thanks. So we're really excited about this event tonight. You know, space is only going to become more important in like a whole range of different policy areas. So it's kind of really important that we have these conversations before that becomes the case. So while we've seen numerous examples of some really great international cooperation, like the ISS, we still need, you know, there's a lot more work that can be done. So that's what we're going to be focusing on tonight, like international cooperation that's already been happening in space and how we can do it better in the future, essentially. So just to kind of give you a run through of how this event's going to work, obviously introducing the topic, then Tom will introduce the speakers and we'll each give them like 10 minutes to kind of talk about why this issue is really important. And then we'll take questions from you guys. So just pop your questions in the chat throughout if you have any. Tom, if you want to introduce the speakers.
Absolutely, I will do. So first member of our panel is Dr. Bleddyn Bowen, who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leicester, as focusing mainly on space policy, security and cooperation. He's also the author of the book War in Space, Strategy, Space Power, Geopolitics, which is quite a juicy title for you there. We've also got Julia Balm, who is a PhD candidate at the Freeman Air and Space Institute at King's College London. And finally, we've got Ali Stickins, who is a researcher of space policy at RUSI. So I think what we'll do is we'll go to each of our speakers in the order that I introduced them. As Amy says, we'll ask them to speak for around 10 minutes and we'll have time for questions. So we'll go first to Dr. Bowen. If you could just please take it away.
Thank you very much, Tom and Amy. Thanks for having me on here tonight. Yes, my pleasure to speak to you. So just looking at my phone now, just to make sure I'm keeping an eye on the 10 minutes, because I will get too excited about these subjects and might just get a bit carried away. Right, so just a few thoughts really for the next 10 minutes on international space cooperation. And being an academic, my first response is to deconstruct the question in terms of what areas are there cooperation in space, and what do we mean by space cooperation really? Because it's like asking what is cooperation at sea or in the air. It's the same kind of scope when you're asking what is cooperation in space. Is there cooperation? Is there enough? We're talking about an entire environment here, a place, and there's a massive diversity of activities, all sectors of state activity and non-state activity happening in space. So it's difficult to generalize too much because this is an entire environment that we're talking about. Really, there's a lot of cooperation of many kinds in space. European space policy, past and present, is defined by integration, the pooling of resources in the industrial, military, commercial, and scientific realms, especially in terms of Western European states from the earliest days of the Cold War. So there's a lot of cooperation on that front. In terms of the United States and its allies, everyone cooperates with the Americans in terms of military and intelligence space capabilities, not least the United Kingdom, which is entirely integrated into the American space and intelligence system, and also the nuclear and missile complexes as well. So, and those are very closely knit to the space sectors too, and the wider military industrial complexes. So there's a lot of cooperation on that front. Most states and non-state actors rely on the United States for space situational awareness, or information about what's flying around in space, where the satellites are whizzing around, where the old defunct satellites that are now space debris, where other little bits of shrapnel that fall off satellites and pose a threat to operational satellites. So we all rely on the Americans who have the single best, most detailed catalogue of space tracking data. So there's a lot of cooperation there, and the Americans voluntarily share that. Not all the stuff, of course, because of military sensitivity, but most of the data comes from the Americans there. So there's a lot of cooperation on that front. We heard about the International Space Station in the introduction, so most people think about that as sort of where space cooperation is and what it can do, and perhaps one of the most visible manifestations of it. And that was a treaty-based cooperation as well between Canada, the United States, Europe, Japan, and Russia, but notably not China. And China has since pursued its own space station program, which will be launched. Which the third space station, which will be launched, I think, later this year. But I'm sure someone might correct me on that. But that's going to be sort of a longer term space station for the Chinese. But apart from China and also India not playing a large role in that, the other big space powers have been involved in the International Space Station, but that was caught up in wider geopolitical motivations, which I'm happy to go into in the Q&A. So it wasn't a purely sort of selfless hands across the oceans with old Cold War nemesis. There were very strong geopolitical interests for the International Space Station being done in the way that it was. Also, interestingly, we've heard a lot about the Trump administration's Artemis programs, so America's general architecture for wanting to put people back on the moon. So the next man, the first woman, as Jim Bridenstine says. Interestingly, this is one area where the Trump administration was more outwardly multilateral and seeking the participation of like-minded nations than other parts of space policy in the Obama administration. The Obama administration was far more US sort of orientated in terms of crude spaceflight exploration plans than the Trump administration was. I think that's very much the influence of Scott Pace in the Trump administration. They're trying to sustain American leadership in long-term crude spaceflight plans. So that's an interesting, more cooperative element of Trump's space policy that really got overshadowed by the Space Force rhetoric. Another area of, if you can call it cooperation, is the International Telecommunications Union, where, at least for most of its members, they tend to get most of what they want to keep the institution going, where the International Telecoms Union allocates the radio frequency spectrum for various kinds of satellites and uses, and also slots in geostationary orbit, so that different satellites and users don't start broadcasting on the same frequencies and therefore start jamming each other. It's not a perfect system, but it's an international organization that is used to allow the big states and the small states to form some kind of bargaining process about who gets what access to what radio frequency allocations. So there's a lot of things that we can term broadly cooperation. There are all sorts of other things in terms of sales agreements. So China and Russia, of course, have been in the news in the last few days with a memorandum of understanding on lunar exploration goals. So it's interesting that Russia now is sort of moving closer towards the Chinese orbit in terms of crewed lunar or robotic lunar exploration as opposed to the American Artemis program. But interestingly, China and Russia have been doing a lot in terms of sales agreements, technical exchanges, scientific cooperation in a lot of areas in high-tech science, including space as well. So there's a lot of other forms of cooperation happening on a bilateral basis outside of US and Europe. So to try and provide something a bit coherent about this, with a lot of space cooperation, we have to be careful that we don't expect cooperation in space to generate more goodwill or cooperation on Earth just because, oh, space is nice and it's sort of what we think should happen in space. People coming together. Space is the heavens. It's not something that should be spoilt by human capriciousness and self-interest and evil. But that is not the reality. And many people think about the Soyuz Apollo rendezvous in orbit in the mid-1970s as a great goodwill gesture between the two Cold War superpowers, and something that helped bring about détente, according to some people. But the Apollo-Soyuz was the high point of détente between the Soviets and the Americans. So in many ways, space politics and space cooperation really is an outgrowth of terrestrial geopolitical trends, not the other way around. So space is so sensitive an area of cooperation for the most part, even in space science and exploration, because of the nature, the dual use nature of the technologies. They are usually outgrowths of existing good political relationships, and requires a fairly good degree of trust and institutional relationships for them to work. The Europeans, the Americans, still had issues with the International Space Station, putting it diplomatically, and they are transatlantic security partners. So building that sort of cooperation takes a lot of effort and is not something that can happen in a vacuum, in a political vacuum, I should clarify. So we have to be careful not to expect too much from space, or just expect space cooperation to happen when you're not going to get that kind of cooperation between those states in other projects on Earth. There's nothing special about things being in space, politically speaking. And I think in terms of maybe more practical issues, to try and think of something more useful to say for policy orientated people, areas where I think there's a lot of more activity needed by states and non-state actors to try and cooperate now on issues like space traffic management. So space is much, much busier now. Earth orbit is much, much busier. So we need to have more concerted action to try and avoid accidental collisions in space. So space traffic management needs more concerted effort and more buy-in by more states and global civil society, really. But also the mega constellations, so OneWeb, Starlink, and Kuiper, the Amazon one, I think. They are forcing the issue now because they are creating so many more objects in space and creating more risks of collision, because they are, we're going from a situation of a couple of thousand satellites in orbit in total to a single mega constellation possibly containing 10,000 satellites by itself. So there's an order of magnitude of more stuff being in space or in Earth orbit. So that requires concerted action. Space debris mitigation and removal, that's another area where there's been some progress on industry standards on reducing the generation of debris, but debris removal is something that might need more cooperation in terms of scale of activity as well. It's an expensive job and it's a collective action problem. Who cleans up a shared environment? There are quite disturbing parallels to the slow pace of addressing climate change on Earth with that in terms of debris in space. So as well as space arms control is another area where there's no real interest in cooperation. It really isn't that important for most states either. Space isn't that interesting to most people anyway. So space arms control is an area that's been completely log-jammed in the United Nations for a few decades at least. There's very little appetite there. The Americans are saying there's no problem to solve in space arms control. Many people differ about that assessment. And then sort of the final area is maybe, establishing rules of the road for a busier lunar environment, which the Artemis Accords is trying to get moving in diplomatic forums as well through the American-led effort to put more to put people and more robots on the moon. So we're going to have a much busier lunar environment. Perhaps Mars as well. I mean, just in the last week or so, there are 3 different probes arriving in Mars. So there needs to be some form of rules of the road to try and manage that traffic better and avoid unintentional accidents or, misunderstandings from happening. You can't do anything about intentionally hostile behavior, but to stop accidents and misinterpretations is sort of where a lot of effort needs to be directed. So I will stop there. Thanks very much for listening. Look forward to the discussion and the following presentations.
Thank you very much, Bleddyn. That was a whirlwind tour, I think, of as much as you could fit into 10 minutes. It was extremely interesting, though, and a lot of points to pick up. I see a few people already asking questions in the chat. So on that note, we'll go now to Julia.
Hello, thanks for having me. This is a really great topic, and I'm glad it's taking up necessary space. The new space age is much more multifaceted and layered than ever before. That boasts a lot of opportunity, but it's also quite ambiguous and uncertain in nature. So with new actors, new activity, and new strategic goals, it's important to communicate about asset development, intentions, and shared interests through cooperation and collaboration. So just to historically go back to the space age and the Cold War, it was really an arena for national security objectives where collaboration materialized in a lot more symbolism than major cooperation. But to step outside of that, other space nations developed interest in space born outside of the superpower competition, and it becomes apparent after the launch of Sputnik that individual efforts were inadequate compared to superpower capability. So just as European and interagency cooperation grew, cooperation with superpowers grew. And states often choose to cooperate or at least moderate their competition via institutions. The reality is, isolationist posture and national interest puts cooperation on the back burner. And this is a danger to our reliance on space because space programs are so ingrained in our daily lives. Cold War international collaboration, weather forecasting sparked early collaborations, but even today, I mean, space systems from weather forecasting, GPS navigation, atomic clocks, flight information, social media stocks, to name just a handful, make it really apparent that space is no longer an option for us on Earth. I mean, over 90% of our data for weathercasting comes from space. It's our global environmental security that depends on space. And it's a unique vantage point for us to look down on Earth and to measure ourselves. To even understand climate change, we need space. And space collaboration allows for better urban planning, emergency response, agricultural management, orbital debris mitigation, and security. But out of this, it's important to note that space is not owned by anyone, and it never will be. So with currently 72 countries with space agencies, innumerable commercial actors, and entrepreneurial ambition that spans the horizon, especially in orbit, the environment will really only be operable if there's a prioritization of cooperation. So if we continue at this rate of pileup on the orbital highway, space will become a junkyard. And without any plans for deorbiting zombie satellites, the old will roam with the new until it's overpopulated and underregulated. So I hate to do this, but I'll use the classic example of China's 2007 ASAT test. But it does raise the prime example of how one's actions affect the entire space environment. The singular event doubled debris at 800-kilometer altitude with 30% increase in debris, just highlighting that keeping the environment operable is not a given. It's something that rests on collaboration and cooperation between actors, whether they be governmental, commercial, academic, or other. Raising also, as Bleddyn already mentioned, the responsible behavior in space, ensuring peaceful uses and sustainable access to space assets and space-based resources. And while there is the Outer Space Treaty from '67, it really is a product of its time in a world where states are increasingly looking to exploit resources, asteroid mining, helium-3, space-based solar power, for example. There's increasing pressure for conduct in space to operate responsibly and sustainably that we really don't have legislation for. and it's not comprehensive for the space economy and ambitions that we're living in today. And Bleddyn already mentioned this, but the Artemis Accords, and though they ground the OST through bilateral agreement and establish a common vision with principles and guidelines and best practices, the condemning of the Accords is an attempt to favor the US and international law and to impose quasi-legal rules stems from a fear of gatekeeping in space that's really important to note when it comes to cooperation. That space power might emerge and be the de facto gatekeeper on these objectives, on these celestial bodies and on the solar system. So it's important to have an enhanced dialogue on these objections, collaboration, on determining responsible practice and negotiated treaty governing lunar exploration, and perhaps through traditional UN forums, even if they may take quite a bit more time. But to go on a positive note, we already talked about the International Space Station, but this is not something to sneeze at. It brings together globally distributed launch operations, training, engineering, and development facilities alongside communication networks and international scientific research community. And the ISS really demonstrates what a fantastic beast cooperation in space can prove to be. And cooperative space efforts can range from handshakes in space to Space Lab, Apollo-Soyuz, ISS, potential lunar gateway moving forward. And a way that cooperation could be encouraged in space is through science, exploration, burden sharing, and shared expertise that joins together interests and allows for similar goals to reach simultaneously. So scientific cooperation does break down barriers we see on Earth today. That being said, there are fluctuating economic conditions, national interests, security, and strategic goals. So when the stars align and missions are strategically relevant for both parties, it does make sense for cooperation, whether it be bilateral, gov to gov, case to case, cooperation between organizations, industry to industry, gov to industry, multilateral. But regardless, it's these dialogues that we have to continue to have for transatlantic cooperation to evolve with the space environment that's constantly evolving. But also to give a recent example where politics have muddled cooperative efforts. Brexit marked a departure for Britain from the EU's Galileo sat-nav system as a third country status. And the UK spent £1.2 billion helping to build Galileo for uses spanning financial transactions and smartphones. But because Galileo is regarded as a security program due to public regulated service with sensitive work for use by military and emergency, the UK can no longer benefit from Galileo's position and navigation timing services. And this demonstrates that the more recent limitations are now imposed on the UK's involvement in ESA. Though of course, the European Space Agency acts as an intergovernmental organization, and the UK continues to participate in the Copernicus program. It just also demonstrates that there are limitations brought by fissile contexts that can make sovereign capability more appealing for longevity and reliability. This is just an example of a hole in cooperative efforts we see today. And it's necessary to also have deliberate integrations of national and international efforts for long-term planning. International participation and cooperation strengthens a domestic position, bolstering program support when times are particularly uncertain. To pull an example from today, it's hard to convince excess budget to be spent on the stuff we can't see on the skies when there's a really highly visible pandemic at the home front. It becomes easy to forget how reliant we are on satellites and space infrastructure and to dismiss budgetary allocation to a space program when domestically, there are innumerable priorities tugging at a national budget. And this is where cooperative efforts can come into play. Space is not an environment in which one can act alone. And as a web, it's a web of a fragile nature in this environment that requires active communication between actors to keep it accessible. And just to quickly highlight, it's not in anyone's favor to degrade space assets, and this is where cooperation is really quite crucial to the longevity of space assets and developments. I mean, why poison the well from which one drinks? So I hope I haven't gone over too much of the same things that Bleddyn has gone over, but feel free to ask me in the Q&A as well. But just to summarize, to keep space safe and sustainable means transparency, predictability, and cooperative communication. Aside from the benefits reaped from cooperation, be it burden sharing, knowledge sharing, you name it, a lack of communication and cooperation would also be extremely detrimental. Cooperation in space that was touched on previously, as it's not always based on goodwill, it really isn't an option if we want continued access to our space assets.
Awesome, thank you. I think you touched on some really important points there that have definitely been neglected. And I agree that the Outer Space Treaty definitely doesn't go far enough at all and doesn't kind of touch on the newer space activity. So on that note, Ali, if you want to go next.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be speaking to you all tonight. Yeah, I mean, Bleddyn and Julia really did cover a lot, but I'll try and maybe fill in a few bits that they didn't touch on. But I think, the points that I'm going to agree with them on are just because they're that important and that we need to think about. A lot of people I talk to who are fairly new to understanding space, there's this whole, why is space suddenly interesting? Why is it suddenly political? But it has been political, arguably since the late 50s when the US, the Soviet Union, realized the potential and benefits that space could bring, particularly to sort of defense and national security. Julia mentioned the Cold War. We look at all of the activity that took place, the US, the Soviet Union, the space race, and all of that was grounded in the political environment of the Cold War. So it's not any really ever been separate. It's not something that we can, that we should be looking at differently. We always have to understand it within that context. What we see now, the changes, is the proliferation of space actors. So more states, but also the commercial actors. And that's something I'll touch on in a bit, but I think it's so important to understand the role that they play. So all the new actors, all the new assets we have, all the new satellites has brought challenges. And the first of those, as the others have mentioned, is the cluttering of the space environment of near Earth orbit. 2,000 plus satellites that is increasing very, very rapidly with the new mega constellations. The problems of space debris, the problems of being able to track and detect space objects. So we need space situational awareness, space traffic management. Just to highlight one of the difficulties in that and why we need to have cooperation. If I have some data, some information about where a satellite is at any given time, and I say this is where it is, that's my opinion of where it is based on the information I have. That's not fact. And another provider of space surveillance, space tracking may have a slightly different opinion of where that is. So the more that we have, the better picture we can have of what's happening. So obviously we need to manage space because we need to avoid collisions. We need to keep that secure. But it's also important for when something happens, if you're looking at a national security context, we have a lot of satellites now with maneuvering capabilities. They can approach other satellites. Some of these are being used for potential debris removal or satellite servicing. They could also be used for other purposes. There was some concern last year about a Russian satellite with a projectile, close approach of others. So if your satellite stops working, you can't always say exactly what that is. You need to have a picture of the environment, the best picture you can. Was it a micro debris strike? Was something else in the environment? The more pictures you have that you can put together, the better understanding you have of what actually happened, and the less likely you are to make a miscalculation. So it's essential for the security of the environment as well, that we can work together to provide that best picture. And of course, the other challenges, Julia touched on, the Chinese anti-satellite missile, but is the proliferation of counter space capabilities. Space is so important for national security and for defense. And so satellites are vulnerable. They are potential targets of other states, whether that's to deny communications capability, to deny intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability, and also, of course, the ground systems, so jamming of GPS systems, for example. And again, so having international cooperation that also looks at intelligence and trying to understand intent of actors, why actors are using space, how they're using it, and how their actions in space can be interpreted within broader conflict. So a lot of challenges, and so the question there is, how does the international community move forward to confront these challenges and to work towards secure, safe, and sustainable space? So the obvious answer is, okay, yeah, we need more international agreements. Let's build on the Outer Space Treaty. And I'm very conscious I'm not going to touch too much on the detail of the Outer Space Treaty, because I know that Professor Chris Newman is in the audience and he is the expert, and he will call me out if I get it wrong. So I'm not going to go into any detail on that. But it is old. It is, I don't want to say out of date, but it doesn't obviously cover the new capabilities and the new context. I've heard it described quite well before as it's the ship we're all sailing on. It doesn't have any sails right now. It's not really going anywhere, but we can't let it sink. We have to build on it and understand how it is. The difficulty is in binding agreements and actually getting that really. Oh, thank you, Chris. That real international agreement. And an example of that is through the UN, through the Conference on Disarmament, something called Farce, which is preventing an arms race in outer space. And this is an initiative that really Russia and China have spearheaded. And through that, a draft treaty they've put forward called the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Orbit Treaty, the PPWT. And this is pretty much stalled. And one reason, the US and others have called out Russia and China for their hypocrisy. Why are you putting this treaty forward whilst at the same time you have been developing and testing counter space capabilities? You've been testing all these anti-satellite missiles. There are difficulties as well in determining what do we mean by a weapon in space, because there are so many dual use capabilities that you can use. As I mentioned, something like debris removal, which is potentially very beneficial, could on the other side then be used to harm or remove an active satellite. And again, this is the point I really want to get across. Politics and space, how we're approaching it, is no different to anything that's happening terrestrially. We've seen discussions in the UN where countries have refused or walked out because of terrestrial competition or terrestrial relationships. They're not just going to suddenly say, oh, it's space, we're going to talk or work with these states when there are so many other things going on. That being said, there have been some initiatives that have seen some progress. So there have been some debris mitigation guidelines. So removing, deliberately deorbiting your satellite at the end of its lifetime, the 25-year rule, and some others that just, it's about responsible behavior. So it's about coming on board and saying we're going to do what we can to preserve the environment. The problem is they're all voluntary agreements. There's no sense of being able to necessarily call people up or respond in any way if actors aren't necessarily abiding by them. So those are the difficulties, but they are steps forward. One of the more recent initiatives, which is going really well, is spearheaded by the UK, and this is again going through the UN, and it's focusing not on capability but on behavior. So rather than saying we're going to try and ban certain technologies or certain capabilities, it's more on accepting the reality of their existence and looking instead on the behaviors that actors are using. So an example for that is on close approach and rendezvous satellites. So looking potentially at, is there a minimum distance that can be agreed upon? If you come closer than that, I am in my right to feel threatened and potentially respond. And notifications on certain maneuvers in space. And I think that this is sort of that middle way that's not necessarily calling people out and saying you've been testing this weapon. It's confronting the reality that states have these capabilities. It's just, how do we behave and how do we cope within that reality? But I mentioned earlier the commercial sector, and I think this is so important to understand their role in terms of the number of satellites and in terms of their capabilities. And two things I want to highlight there. There's something called the Space Data Association, which is a group of space operators. And it's a way for them to be able to communicate when there's a potential conjunction of two satellites, for example. So almost cutting out the middleman and being able to talk directly to each other. There's also an initiative that DARPA in the US is involved in, but again, working with the commercial sector. And this is on close approach and rendezvous. It's about that notification, about understanding some rules of the road for how we do that. But again, you know, just I think looking at the UK context, for example, space, yes, we know it's important for defense and national security and all this, but we have to think, you know, why is the UK suddenly, you know, moving forward? We've got a National Space Council, a Space Command, you know, and all this. And it's all tied into, you know, the broader goals the UK has in foreign policy, soft power, you know, that almost posturing of saying, you know, we want to be a space power. So again, you know, we can't separate it. Wanted to, you know, just mention again, asteroid mining, I think is going to be one of those really, really difficult areas as that comes forward in terms of international cooperation. You know, and I think my last point is, it comes down to the difficulties that we've seen in terms of, you know, getting some of these initiatives off the ground. International cooperation is going to be limited to alliances, to partnerships. And it's going to be the strength of those alliances and partnerships and how well they can work together to start getting some movement on rules of the road and responsible behavior and sustainability. And almost making pariahs of those that kind of go in the opposite direction. Full international cooperation where everyone's on board, I just can't see happening. I'm sorry, that's not very, you know, sort of optimistic view, but I think it's just the reality. Look at climate change, look at all these other threats that we're facing. You know, we can't get together on that. So it's really going to be a few actors who are really willing to stick their neck out, get the ball rolling, and try and get, you know, willing partners on board. I'll stop there, and yeah, looking forward to the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ali. We've got a lot of questions actually, and I think all three of you have covered a huge area of different topics. But yes, so I think we'll start with the first one that came in, which was quite early on, I believe, came from Kieran, and that was specifically looking at the US. Kieran, would you like to ask your question, or are you happy for me to read it out?
Can you read it out?
Absolutely, no worries. So Kieran asks, do you think the Biden administration will change anything about the ITAR, which I believe is the International Traffic in Arms Regulations? Is there any of the three of you that feel you could speak to that?
I'll happily go on that if
nobody else. Bleddyn. I did.
Short answer is I haven't heard anything to suggest that there's going to be changes there. Trump didn't do anything. Biden hasn't said anything. I mean, we haven't got any details about any Biden space policy really, other than confirming what we knew in terms of only Congress can get rid of Space Force, and therefore that's not going to change. And there's also been some noise about, you know, they're going to stick with the Artemis program, but beyond that, there's like nothing more about any particular changes on space policy that we can sort of anticipate. You know, of course, climate science with NASA and other parts of the federal government are going to be restored and possibly accelerated with Biden given his climate policy plank in the election. But in terms of ITAR, yeah, I see no indications yet there's going to be big changes there.
Thank you very much. And we've got a question here from Emily Powers. Emily, are you happy to read out your question, or would you like me to read it out?
Oh, you can read it out. Thank you.
So Emily's question, well, first of all, she says to Julia, very insightful points on gatekeeping, wonderful presentation. So her question is, she was wondering if you could speak to whether or not the Space Force is disjointing cooperation. And so that one's for Julia.
Thank you, Emily. Very kind words. I think it's important to note that the Space Force is not an entirely new concept. It's really just a bureaucratic shift in institutional workings. And it gets a bad rep for many reasons, including horrible communication. But it's really a military service tasked to ensure that outer space remains free, especially when it's bedecked with increasing actors in a bold space economy. And it's not dissimilar to British naval thinking, but I'll leave that to Bleddyn. But just to say that the protection of commerce and access to assets is really akin to US naval, or the US Navy on the high seas in many ways. And I think it has a lot of potential to bring longevity to an otherwise diplomatically fissile area where there's 4 to 8 years of administrations that can hinder program sustainability and long-term goals, especially when other space programs think in terms of hundreds of years. China, for instance. Which is also to say that the swearing in of US astronauts on the ISS into the Space Force is not necessarily a cooperative effort, but rather a fracture in the goals that we hold near and dear to the framework of such a pioneering cooperative endeavor, such as the ISS. So it's important to keep an eye on what the Guardians have planned, but that's my take.
Can I just come in on that quickly? On that?
Yeah, of course.
So I think, it's important to look at sort of military intelligence cooperation and then broader international cooperation. And so, within the military side, reorganizing, space programs, and we see it with the UK as well, with what will be UK Space Command, actually can assist with cooperation in those alliances, because you have a better structure and that maybe that one point person rather than a disjointed structure of 6 or 7 people who've all got a bit of space working, and that's always going to go on. And so I think that the changes that we're seeing in military space programs, in my view, aren't going to change the nature of international cooperation. Is that it's reorganizing how they how they are, and it's not that they're suddenly going to have military space personnel orbiting and shooting each other in space. So it can help alliances, it can help within NATO or within Five Eyes, for example, but that is a reality, and so I don't see how that should impact on the other areas of international cooperation.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. It's just Space Force is doing what US Air Force was already doing. In terms of substance, there's nothing new to the Space Force. We'll have to see in the next 20, 30 years what changes, if anything, the Space Force will manage to do in terms of hardware acquisition for the Department of Defense, but also the development of a space power culture, which they'll have their own system of staff development and training and education and prestige as well, that is separate now from the air dominator culture of the US Air Force. So those are the long-term changes, but in the short term, there's nothing of substance that's new from the Space Force. But yeah, their communications have been a bit tone deaf, I suppose, is a diplomatic way to say it. But in substance, yeah, I don't see US Space Force changing that, but they just need to watch what they say and how they look, I think, a bit more.
Thank you for that. Pani, I know you have your hand raised if you want to comment. Also, I should say, Pani came up with a name for this event tonight, and he kind of slated me when I didn't give him a shout out before. It is quite a cool name, so there you go.
Thank you all for a really informative and interesting event. So I've actually got 2 questions. So my first one is relating to the Outer Space Treaty, which says that no country can claim sovereignty over a part of space, but it doesn't mention ownership of space by like a private company. So obviously with SpaceX and various other companies involved in that sphere, what kind of regulation do you think could be brought in. And relating to the Kessler syndrome with like satellites and space debris, what kind of international cooperation do you see in terms of ensuring that space remains somewhere that we can sort of go and access?
That was a really interesting double question you got in there, Fanny. Very cheeky. Okay. So can we fill that one, Bleddyn? Are you all right to say that one for us to begin with?
Yeah, sure. On the first one, again, I like Ali earlier, I'm afraid of incurring the wrath of Professor Chris Newman, who's in the audience, who's an actual space law academic. But yes, I will venture to say something on the OST. So yeah, the OST prohibits the territorial appropriation in space, and also that that nobody can claim sovereignty over the volumes of like orbital zones or anything like that. However, states retain sovereignty over the objects which they've launched. So, you know, if you're American GPS satellite, that's a sovereign US. I was going to say vessel, but spacecraft is a sovereign US object. So is all the junk that creates as well. And, you know, debris is still the sovereign property of the launching state. And then in terms of private actors, again, I'm on less confident ground here, and Chris is probably going to scream at me down his muted microphone. But states are ultimately or launching states are ultimately liable for what non-state actors registered within them do in space. So if Elon Musk somehow does get to Mars and then does some really silly things that violate environmental protection principles of the OST, presumably he'll still be a US citizen, and his company is going to be registered in the United States. The US will be liable for the damages. So private companies or non-state actors are still answerable to the state they're registered with or the launching state, or some combination of both, because not all registered states are launching states. So there's a liability chain already there in the Outer Space Treaty, which is why I'm a bit, I don't know, not, I guess, defensive of the Outer Space Treaty, because a lot of people condemn it for not actually spelling out how can you get rich in space. Well, companies have been doing that for decades already. So they've already established liability and how commerce works in space. It does get complicated with resource extraction, because yeah, you can't claim territory on the moon. It's a gray area in terms of claiming extracted materials, but we've seen certain countries like America, Luxembourg, I know there's a few other. I'm not sure if China's thinking about it, whether they've done it yet. They're thinking about it, passing laws that says companies who get resources from space or from the moon can sell it there. And so it is a grey area there. In terms of cooperation on Kessler syndrome, well, the sovereignty issue is an issue there. So a Swiss cleanup robot can't start taking out a piece of junk that belongs to the Americans unless the Americans give it permission, because that will be violating the object sovereignty rule. In terms of where cooperation, I think a lot of it will have to be done by the richest states having to clean up the mess their companies have created. I think that's, and that can be done fairly unilaterally, but you probably need some cooperation in terms of signaling maneuvers that Ali was talking about earlier, so that nobody starts getting worried about what's this thing doing, you know, orbiting around in these strange patterns. So there has to be some sort of transparency and communication about this is this mission, we're doing this, we're doing that, nobody be alarmed. So I think there's a lot of scope for unilateral action there, but a lot of operations are going to need somebody to pay for it. And so it's interesting, a lot of commercial companies are getting into this. They want the government contracts to clean that up because nobody else is going to pay to clean up space.
Just a couple of, I just want to like reiterate what Bleddyn was saying, I think about, you know, the liability issue, and it's one of the reasons why regulation is so difficult, you know, why states are, you know, it's difficult to be able to figure out the regulation sometimes, because they are aware of that liability. So, you know, you don't want to just give it a free for all and go, yeah, we'll have really lax regulation to try and attract companies, because, you know, part of it, you want to attract companies to, you know, your state so that, you know, there's the economic benefits and the jobs, etc. But at the same time, you know, you don't want to be liable. You also have your international standing, you know, with being a responsible actor. yeah, I think the really difficult thing there is going to be around asteroid mining, and when you start having resources brought back, potential competition over those resources, not necessarily in terms of like conflict, but you could see in a slightly more distant future, two commercial companies, both after the same the same resources. Again, yeah, Kessler syndrome, it is ideally what everyone wants, everyone agrees is what is an international, body of some kind that helps to manage space and, organize the cleanup and make sure everyone's, deorbiting their satellites. But yeah, who would organize that and who'd actually pay for it? It is going to come down to those few actors who can do that. Who have the financial resources, and also probably the most to lose, because they have the most reliance or the most assets in space. So they're going to be doing that. But I do think more work on gaining the trust and cooperation of the commercial sector is going to be really important with this. So they're the ones who are going to have the most satellites in space. And we've already seen problems with Starlink, and the fact that they were, all the satellites were reflecting, and the terrestrial astronomers were complaining about that. And they have the ability to move their technology forward. They can take risks. They have the financial resources, and it's just maybe reminding them that everything they do affects everyone else. It's not just about them. It can't just be that one sort of. It's not all just financial. So ensuring that and I think by bringing them into the conversation and saying we can learn from your experience as well, make them feel sort of trusted partners within all of that is really important.
Thank you, Ali. I'm just conscious of time. I want to try and get a couple more questions in, but I think the speakers answered a few questions actually in one there. A few people have been asking about Elon Musk and Tesla and all that. But I was telling someone earlier today about this event, and they asked if I would get on one of Richard Branson's rockets. So I think that's kind of just the first thing that people's minds go to. So we've got a question here from Dr. Lucas. And that is in reference to China's growing political ambition. So giving the example of One Belt, One Road. So regarding that problem, how much effort, in your opinion, should be put into coherent space policy addressed towards the Arctic area? And I wonder, Julia, would you like to say something around that?
Gosh, this is really not my expertise. But I might pass this one on to the other speakers, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine, no worries. Ali, would you like to come in on this? Oh,
no, again, sorry, it's not really my my area. I don't really know what I would be able to add to that. Sorry.
That's absolutely no worries. And Bleddyn, are you going to tell me the same thing?
Unfortunately, yes.
That's absolutely fine.
I don't know pretty much anything about Arctic politics. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, we have got a question here, though, and all of you, I think, touched on it in your opening statement. But someone asks, what are the odds? You don't have to put a number on it. What are the odds of any space arms control being passed? Are there any specific operations or behaviors that could be the substance of realistic arms control? So I will take that one to Julia. I feel like probably be more comfortable with that one.
Yeah, okay, I can give that a shot. Well, the ambiguous nature of space, we talk about it as being really threatening, but it's also quite malleable in a positive way, where you can really do anything on the orbital highway at the moment. You can do anything, which is quite positive for a lot of space actors operating in space. But I think a lot of what we should be focusing on should be understanding motives and intent. I mean, Ali touched on this quite a bit, but what is really happening in space and why would really get to the heart of dual use, because that's really difficult to assess in arms control. We could go into the militarization of space, weaponization and space weapons, but it's really hard to categorize intent. Say if you get into jamming, it's really difficult to attribute which actor potentially jammed your satellite. So space arms control is really difficult to assess. I think we should really go back to motives, frankly. If you just look at Russian cosmism, that's not the topic of this, but that's my jam. But if you just go back to Russian cosmism and understand how hearts inform certain security postures that are not necessarily mind-based, it really helps you understand why budgetary allocation to certain programs could be given, or what the intent is behind any sort of capability or any sort of operation in space. And the Space Force does have a branch now that does assess intent, but I do think that's really limited to just the Space Force. So that's a difficult one, but I can pass it on.
Go for it, Ali.
Yeah, I saw who asked that question. So hi, Daniel, thanks for that. Really helpful. I mean, I'm pessimistic that we'll ever see a real arms control treaty in the broadest sense. I do think that the way to start is on behaviours. So the UK initiative that I talked about, which comes into what Julia was saying about intent and understanding why actors are doing certain things. But I do think that there are areas where we may see some progress from behaviours that I think could lead to something more concrete. One of those I touched on earlier, that's on close approach and rendezvous. So again, looking at minimum distances, for example, and ensuring that you're giving notification of what activities you'll be carrying out. So that's one area. I think another potential area is on kinetic ASAT testing. Everyone always mentions again that the Chinese test of 2007, that was at quite a high altitude, and therefore the debris stays in orbit for much longer. If you look at the Indian test of a couple of years ago, that was at a much lower orbit. It didn't have the same international reaction, partly because it was India, not China, but I think also, lower altitude, much less debris. And it was almost described at times as being sort of a responsible ASAT test. It's like, we don't like ASAT tests, but if you do it at a low enough altitude, like, it's okay. We won't really complain too much. So I think that's a potential area. But there's just, there's such a spectrum of counter space capabilities, because you start to bring in, potential cyber attacks. You've got, optical dazzling. You've got, maybe microwave frequency. So the, interference or potential damaging of components. So, yeah. I don't see anything really big and concrete, but I do think that we can start to make progress on very, very specific capabilities and activities, which may in time build trust amongst the community and could lead to something that resembles more of an arms control treaty than obviously what there is now.
Thank you. And kind of just before we start to wrap up, obviously we've talked obviously about international cooperation, but as each of you have alluded to, the UK is starting to take or trying to take a leading role in this area. So obviously we have got the National Space Council, but as of yet it hasn't actually published any kind of space strategy. Now that might come along in the next year, what with the G7, the COP26, the integrated review. But I wonder, for any of you that would be happy to answer this, if you were to give the authors of such space strategy just one thing that should definitely end up in there, what would it be? I'm going to go to Bleddyn because he looks terrified.
I don't know where to start in answering that question, really. On the military side, people can Google my paper on UK space power and the integrated review. On the defence space strategy side, I've got 7 main recommendations there. But if those are one thing, was telling people in the National Space Council, you need people, you need operational expertise. There's just so little of it in the British state about people and actually understanding, how do you fly a satellite? How do you understand the Earth orbit environment? The British state needs that operational knowledge and experience and expertise. At the moment, it's all in allied countries or in the private sector. there's not a lot of it in-house in the British state, including the MOD there. So more expertise in actually space operations is much, much needed in the UK. So investing in people and skills there, genuine space experts.
Okay, Ali?
I would definitely agree with that. That's needed. I think for me, it's around coherence and cross-government working. So the relationship between the MOD and the UK Space Agency has improved, without a doubt. That is better than it was. But better cross-government working, having a sort of a point person for space, cross-government, not just the MOD or Space Agency, but maybe to bring that all together, because it does impact on agriculture and transportation and all these other areas of government, and all these other departments. So bringing that together, I suppose, for me would be number one. And I think number two, if someone could please explain to me why the UK is still after its own sovereign launch capability, I'd be really grateful, because I still don't understand it. Thank you.
And finally, Julia?
Yeah, I agree with both. I wasn't on board with the sovereign launch capability until recently, where I've sort of seen more value of it with Cornwall. But yeah, I mean, I'd agree with both. I think resiliency and a great deal of risk-taking needs to happen in R&D, but also reasons why the UK is approaching certain tasks needs to be, sorry, Sophie, why the UK is approaching certain capabilities. There has to be a priority or some sort of prioritization of what the UK really wants to do, because ambition's great, but our ambition in the skies is great, but it's got to be grounded, and can't bite off more than it can chew.
I suppose it's difficult for Johnson to try and level up space as well. That might be a difficult task. Amy?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask like one last kind of quick question from you guys before I bring it to a close. So do you think that we will ever see kind of comprehensive treaties that really actually seek to limit what we can do in space beyond weapons of mass destruction? Because I wouldn't really say that's that comprehensive. So I'd be really interested to hear your take on whether you think it's really possible. If any of you want to go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to say quickly no. Since we're intent on using Earth orbit at the moment to make it easier and more efficient to kill people and break things on Earth, we're going to carry on using space for those purposes, and therefore satellites are going to carry on being useful targets to potentially hit in wartime. And everyone is modernizing along the same lines the Americans showed what could be done with military space power back in the 1991 Gulf War, which had its 30th anniversary this year. Just in the last, now actually. We're not going to have something that really constrains the freedom of action that all states and militaries on Earth have enjoyed since the 1950s and the 1960s. So I don't think we'll see anything further than the loose ban on weapons of mass destruction in space. Other conventional methods will carry on, because space is so useful to politics, violence, and economic competition on Earth. So they'll compete in any ways that they want to, that haven't already been agreed away.
Yeah, just to build on that, I mean, at the moment, no agreements would be possible, unless you have Russia, US, China on board. And actually, if you look at the way things are at the moment, it kind of suits them, because they can really do what they want. There is a certain vagueness in some of the outer space treaty, or some of the way that we think about weaponization or militarization and all that, and because it's not clearly defined, and because we don't have those really concrete agreements on what we mean by a weapon or anything like that, it does suit them, and it does allow them then to use space for their terrestrial ambitions. So again, unless we have a huge change in the way that humans are acting on Earth, why are we going to act differently in space? We're humans, and we're always going to be that. So we need to stop thinking of space as some sort of sanctuary or magical place where greed and corruption and all that doesn't exist, unfortunately.
That was quite depressing, but I think I agree. Julia, if you want to come in.
I mean, honestly, I agree with Ali. I don't think I have much to add other than that.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, you'd think that asteroid deflection would at least be one area that we could all come together on, but it does seem quite unlikely. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming and asking questions, and thank you to all the speakers. You've been really amazing, and I think definitely raised some important issues that we probably hadn't thought about before. So thanks, guys. It's up on Facebook as well. If you might have missed the start, you can rewatch it. But thanks, guys. Hope you all have a good night.